Good afternoon and welcome to Volunteering Victoria's new webinar series. I'm Sara Sterling, our Sector Development Manager, and I'm pleased to be bringing you these webinars on what should be a monthly basis about volunteer managers talking about their experience related to themes of volunteer management. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land which we call Australia. Though we're likely logging on from different parts of Australia, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future from traditional custodians across the country. I have a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our two guests. In the interest of the other listeners, would you please keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar? You should have all arrived on mute, but you should be able to check down the bottom by hovering your mouse over the screen. There's a public chat box which will send messages or hellos to all participants, and feel free to introduce yourself to other listeners, but be aware that if you have a question, we'd ask that you submit it through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We appreciate, given this is our second webinar, we appreciate you bearing with us through any technical glitches, and it will be available to live stream through Volunteering Victoria's website in the next few days. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guests, Adele Stowe-Lindner and Kerry Uren, who will be chatting with me today about their journeys in building an evidence base related to volunteering. So Adele Stowe-Lindner is the National Programs Manager at Ardoch, working with monitoring and evaluation as a method for demonstrating evidence of impact, as well as crucial tools for quality improvement and decision making. Adele has a master's in anthropology and community work from the University of London and has been working in the not-for-profit sector for 17 years. Kerry has been an executive officer at Interchange, Incorporated since 2013, and is a passionate advocate of ensuring a diverse and sustainable sector. She's a skilled facilitator and strategist who is committed to ensuring that many voices and perspectives of all stakeholders are canvassed and accurately represented through the most effective platforms. Kerry has been instrumental in advocating for sustainability of volunteer-supported service models within the NDIS framework and is involved in numerous initiatives designed to secure ongoing commitment from the Victorian State Government to support significant research in the area. One major example is the first of its kind research project in Australia aimed at gathering evidence that will inform government policy and support applications for continued funding of these service models. So thank you to everyone for joining me, particularly Adele and Kerry. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Now, I just wanted to check in with those online, given the audio problems we experienced last time. Can everyone hear us? Please feel free to share on chat for those participants who are online or via Q&A. I'm going to assume, given we've seen, yes, wonderful. I can see that most people are saying that the sound is all good. So thank you very much for that feedback. And we will kick straight off into things. So thank you very much. So to start off with, I would like to introduce our first two panelists to really talk about their background and their organisation. So I'll throw it first to Adele. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So Ardoch has been working for the last 30 years. We had our 30th year anniversary last year. Our vision is that children and young people fulfil their potential through full participation in education. So we currently work with 106 disadvantaged school and early years communities around Melbourne, in Geelong, Frankston, Dandenong and Melbourne's West in Victoria, as well as in other states. We work thanks to 1,700 dedicated volunteers, and we supported last year 15,000 students. So they're children and young people, all the way from preschool and kinder to the end of school.
Wonderful, thanks. How about yourself, Kerry?
Well, as you mentioned, I've been Executive Officer with Interchange Incorporated since 2013. Interchange Incorporated is a membership-based organisation in the disability sector. Our members are disability service organisations that offer social and recreational programs to individuals and families living with disability. And volunteers are integral to supporting the delivery of those programs. Previously, I worked in the mental health industry for 10 years with a not-for-profit EAP provider.
So thanks, and really acknowledging that in this context here in this webinar, well, both Kerry and Adele are not on the ground volunteer managers. Both of their organisations support broad volunteering programs, and this topic of building an evidence base is something that we've received feedback that people are really interested to hear about. So I guess with that in mind, I'd like to ask you, potentially we'll throw to Kerry first this time. How did you get involved in building an evidence base for your organisation, or in your case, Kerry, building an evidence base for the type of work that your organisation almost does?
Okay. The introduction of the NDIS has raised significant concerns around volunteer-supported programs within the disability sector. It's created challenges for the disability service providers because the NDIA defines which services are covered under the NDIS and at what hourly rates those services are paid. And it's created a lot of challenges because it's not included some of the critical components and some of the key volunteer-supported services that the disability services organisations have been offering to people with disability and their families. So funding challenges are creating a lot of concern amongst the sector. The ambiguity around the funding of those programs has actually led some of the disability service organisations already to put on hold the intake of more people with disability and their families. So that's reduced their capacity to access the services, which then obviously reduces social inclusion opportunities and community participation for people. In the meantime, the NDIA still hasn't quite decided where the funding will come from for disability service organisations, or even if they'll acknowledge including some of them within the NDIS framework within either of the funding frameworks. So in order for us to advocate and consult to ensure continuity and sustainability of those services, we needed data. The conversation had been started with the state government and with the agency, but they were all saying we need more information than just the feel-good stories about how good it is to have these programs running within the sector. So the purpose of the research is to provide an evidence base that we hope will inform policy change on a national basis around volunteer-supported programs, and to enable the Commonwealth Government and the state government to make some decisions around continued funding and sustainability of volunteer-supported programs in the disability sector.
It's really, I guess, showing the value that those programs bring.
That's correct.
To the families.
That's correct.
Those with a disability themselves. Wow, so big challenge you took on.
It is.
And so how about you, Adele? How did you get involved in building an evidence base for your organisation?
So our aim at Ardoch is to scale high impact programs, and I'm the National Programs Manager. So one of the questions was, we deliver a suite of programs. So if our aim is to scale high impact programs, how are we going to choose which of our programs are the highest impact? So which of the programs have the most added value? Which ones can we efficiently scale? Which ones have the most efficacy for what we're trying to do? And part of that was that we went through a process of building an outcomes framework so that we could actually help ourselves to make those decisions. So when we built the outcomes framework, we identified that there are 5 components that we at Ardoch would say, if a program does not fulfill some of those components, then it's not an Ardoch program. It's not something that we should run. And there were a couple of our programs at that time that we were able to see by going through that process of building an outcomes framework. We were able to say, you know what, these are things that actually other people are best to deliver, and they're not actually fulfilling what we're trying to do. So that's how we started in terms of how our evaluations work. So we use evaluations to help us make decisions in that way about what we should scale and where we should scale it. We use evaluations to identify program improvement, and we also use evaluations to identify the evidence behind what we do that helps us to make those decisions, but also obviously helps us to get funding so that we can demonstrate to other people why what we're doing is useful and why it should be a good investment for other people. So the process, how I became much more active in that in our organisation, is that we identified that we needed to invest in being able to do that. So part of that is supporting my time to do that, and part of that is identifying partners that will help us to do that, and identifying funders that will help us to do that. So it's very much a community of practice. That's the only way that we've been able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it takes a village probably also applies to research. So I know that a lot of your research and evaluation efforts are really ongoing, but is there much that you've kind of learnt from those research and evaluation efforts at this point in time? I might go to you first, Adele.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very much connected to why we evaluate in the first place. So, I'm focusing today very much on our evaluations, or mostly on our evaluations that help us internally, so that our listeners can really get a breadth of understanding in terms of external evaluations and how we use them within our organisation. So for us, one of our learnings was about why people might not want to engage with our evaluations, so with surveys, for example. So we learned that sometimes people, especially when they're working with vulnerable populations, as many of your member organisations are, sometimes our volunteers and also our teachers are very protective of the beneficiaries that they're working with. And so we found that they feared to, they thought that what we were doing was an assessment, which was a judgment about where people were at or where the program was at. And we really worked hard to communicate both internally to our own internal stakeholders, so our staff, ourselves, and also the people doing the surveys, that we're coming from a non-judgmental approach. So we're not making a judgment on what we find, we're only trying to find data so that we can look for themes that will help us ask questions, and those questions in turn will help us make decisions that will help us benefit our students, our beneficiaries, in accordance with our vision and mission as much as possible. So we really wanted to take everyone on that journey with us. So that was one of the key things that we learned. We also learned that sometimes, with keeping that in mind, the non-judgmental approach, and we don't know what we're going to find, that sometimes the results are a huge surprise. So, and it helps us to actually learn about a program we thought we knew about in the first place. So an example is a Learning Through Lunch program that we delivered that we had thought was actually career-based. So we thought it was very much about supporting students to engage with hospitality as a career path, which it is. But actually, when we were asking the students, what do you remember most about that program, or what experience really reached them the most, often they would actually say it was the experience of new food that was the most memorable. So that helps us to make a decision to adapt that program so that we added a tour of a TAFE or specific presentations by trainee waiters and chefs to that experience, so that we could acknowledge that that new food experience was something very meaningful to the students, but that actually the program as it stood at that time was not fulfilling our aim, and we needed to actually add a component to that program to fulfill the aim. The third is that we went through a process of looking at numbers, which was really interesting because this was not going out and using survey tools. This was data we had already. So we were using our database. We were pulling reports and putting them on Excel. Some of these numbers we actually were only looking at Excel. So we went through a process of saying we actually collect this information anyway as we're trying to work with volunteers and keep everything safe and process people and know our numbers and just keep on top of our stakeholders and keep on top of our volunteers and where people are and when people are doing it. So just taking a step back and not doing our work and actually just looking at a spreadsheet together, what we identified is that actually we ask our volunteers to make a 6-month commitment, but we learned that we were losing volunteers at the 3-month mark. So we adapted the program to invest a huge amount more time before the 3 months. So in that first 12 weeks that a volunteer is with us now, they get a high number of check-ins, they get a high number of conversations and of visits. And what we found actually is a year later that has completely changed our numbers. So we saw that if people stayed 3 months, they definitely stayed 6, if not 12, but we were struggling just to keep them at 3. So that made a huge improvement on our program. And that one, I think, is the most interesting because we didn't go out to design a survey or to design an evaluation. It was just about giving ourselves permission to give ourselves the time to actually look critically at any patterns we could see in the information that we already had.
Absolutely. It's, you know, and what a great improvement for, you know, people, you know, who are volunteer managers and looking, you know, logging on. That's such a huge impact if you can improve your retention at a particular rate. You know, it really eases some of the pressure around constantly recruiting volunteers, and that data is already or was already at the time that Ardoch was looking at it in front of them. How about you, Kerry? Your research project, maybe, you know, you don't have real results yet, but to talk about what you've learned about the process of managing a research project.
Yes, our research project is actually in the draft report stage, which is really exciting. We're hoping to launch that in the next 4 weeks. But when I stepped back and had a look how we'd been managing, I suppose, over the last 12 months, the first thing I thought of in terms of learnings was that you need to know exactly what the purpose of your research is. And that sounds easy in the initial stages, but it's actually really quite difficult to define when you start to break it down. You really need to be clear about what you want the end result to be. So whether that's the whole purpose of the work or specific data on numbers or outcomes or methodologies that are out there in the sector, you really need to fine tune what that is so you can get your research questions right. And that's sometimes a bit difficult because you don't always know what you don't know. So the unknown unknowns and the known unknowns that everyone talks about. So yeah, you do need to be really clear about what you want the end result to be. You also need to be clear about who is going to use the data for critical decision making. And that also made us reframe the key questions within the research, because there's no point having some information that says, well, this is how you build this project, if the people that were reading it weren't interested in how you built it, they were interested in something else. So that was a really critical learning. And also the other learning was you need to be so good at project management. You need to be able to, in addition to really fine-tuning the key purpose, the end stakeholders, all of that whole circle, you need to be so good at project management skills to effectively, firstly, map out the process of the way that you're going to undertake the research, all the different steps that need to be undertaken in order to gather the evidence that are required. So for us, initially, we undertook a very short survey, followed by a few months later, a longer survey in more detail. Then we also went out and asked some of the responders if they were interested in participating in case studies. And then researchers went into their organisations for a few days and undertook some more conversations with various stakeholders in those organisations. So there was really quite a few steps that were required to be able to map that out, to gather the evidence. So you need to be able to map out that process and the time frames and who's responsible.
And coordinate a lot of people by the sound.
A lot of people practically need a communications plan as well for how everyone's going to be connecting with one another and how you're going to be communicating with all the participants along the way, as well as the funding stakeholders, which of course is critical to get them up to date. And to be able to engage and influence key stakeholders was really important too. So there was quite a few different areas of learning throughout the process.
Absolutely. And just to remind everyone on the webinar, like this is a massive, lengthy, years-long research project that Kerry is talking about.
Yes.
You will start smaller if you're building an evidence base at your organisation. So please don't get intimidated for anyone who's on the other end. So like on that theme of people, and I think it's really important to think about, I think that point about who your audience is so key, and making sure you're collecting the right information to target them. There are a lot of people involved in research, whether it's, your managers and your board or around authorising the time spent around the research, or, your stakeholders, many people who are involved in the programs, many people who are involved, potentially with funding bodies. Out of all of this like breadth of stakeholders and people who are involved in building an evidence base, who was the hardest stakeholder to get on board, and what was the messaging that you used to convince them, or did they end up in the too hard basket?
I think from my perspective, all of the stakeholders knew that the research was really critical for change and for sustainability of volunteer supported programs. So, from the government who are making the decisions, through the service providers who are developing and offering the programs, through to the individuals and the families that are accessing the programs, everybody, and the volunteers and the communities, obviously, that they're operating within, everybody kept telling us, this is so critical, we'll support you 100%. But the challenge we found was twofold. The first one was sourcing funding, which is always difficult for anything, let alone a major research project. Networking here was probably key to that, and being able to influence key decision makers and stakeholders in terms of, going back to my previous comment about identifying the end user of the data making sure that we had buy-in and commitment from those people. So in this instance, we actually received a significant amount of funding from the state government through DHHS, as well as from the NDIS transition team, which sits within DHHS as well, but is funded through the NDIA. So because they're the two main stakeholders, they ended up being the two biggest committed funders. But the process to getting that, I mean, I submitted a business case for funding a full 12 months before the conversation really got down to, we're actually going to give you some funding now, let's talk about how much and what we want from it. So it was a really lengthy process in terms of advocacy and networking and influencing around that process. The second challenge, I guess, in terms of stakeholders was engaging the research participants themselves, because even though for them it's so critical to be able to continue running their businesses and the programs within their businesses, everyone's so time poor, and particularly with the transition to the NDIS, there's a whole paradigm shift in how they are running their businesses. So they're transiting from, you know, state block funding to consumer funding. Really, the people with living with disability are being allocated funding directly, and they get to decide what they want, who they want it from, and what that program will look like. So it really is a significant shift right across the whole sector. So even though they were really passionate about us doing it, it was really tricky. We had to keep in touch with them a lot to ask them to participate or to commit the time and the staff within the organisation who could provide us with the evidence that we needed. Then we also needed to, you know, have some people who were happy for us to then go in and participate with the case studies, which was another couple of days, which is a lot of time out of an organisation. Then we also asked for input from volunteers and the people living with disability who spend time with volunteers within those organisations to also contribute to providing us with some evidence around the outcome side of it. So it was very challenging in that regard, but just being able to remind people of the commitment from the state and Commonwealth government and the benefits that we would be able to receive from that, and just keep them up to date with exactly what was happening, really helped, I think, to for them to commit people within their organisations to contribute the data. So, you know, techniques that we used were to get people to engage, where we actually had the state government helping us to promote the project. So they were going to the disability service organisations that they were providing funding to for the programs and encouraging them to participate within the program. They were asking their local area managers as well to contact the local networks, so that we had several layers of communication coming out through the funders. We also promoted it quite widely on as many networks as we could. So the NDS promoted it, the peak body, the National Peak Body for Disability. Pro Bono wrote an article on it, which was fantastic, through the Melbourne University, who was undertaking the research. We phoned people, we sent emails, we kept sending email reminders. We gave them updates on what stage we're at. We asked people to share the information and the research within their own networks so we can encourage more engagement, which worked really well. And then we also decided to offer them as many access points as possible, so to be able to engage with the research, so they could participate online or on their mobile phones or by telephone conversations or face-to-face, whatever suited them best to be able to provide the information. We offered all of those options to them in terms of the gathering of the evidence component.
That's great, because often I suppose you have people who are really committed or really, you know, engaged and invested in the research outcome, but might only have a, you know, kind of 20-minute slot to take a survey on a tram. So
yes.
Making sure it's mobile friendly.
Yes.
Is really important. How about you, Adele?
The question was really about getting the data from the stakeholders and who's the most difficult. For us, we have various stakeholders, so we get information from volunteers who volunteer every week. We get information from volunteers who will do a one-off program, who are doing a one-year program of writing letters or blogs, every month or so. So we also get information from school principals and early years directors, and we get it directly from teachers, and we also really try and prioritise getting the student voice involved. So last year we had over 1,000 students feeding back to us through surveys, and that's something that's really important to us because they are the end beneficiary, and having that input into helping us to make decisions about our programs is really important. So an example is asking them about what kind of careers was the most interesting if they participate in a Speed Careers program or in a Learning Through Lunch program. Helps us to try and understand what piques the students' interest and what we should be doing more of or maintaining, and what maybe we need to remove. So that comes with different interesting aspects. So getting information from students who are in primary school is really different to getting it from students who are in secondary school, and the language needs to be different in the surveys, and that's something that we learned. But also, a lot of the schools don't have devices. So you just talked about doing a quick survey on your phone, but that doesn't work if you're trying to get input from 25 students who don't have a phone and also don't have devices because they're in grade 3 or grade 4. But you want to make sure for some programs that you are getting a really high take up. So in terms of students, sometimes we'll print the surveys and we'll get them done on paper, and then volunteers help us to input it so that we can actually use that on a technology system rather than getting the students themselves to do it on a link. So that is something that is not straightforward, getting the student voice involved. Last year we did an evaluation of our Literacy Buddies and Numeracy Buddies program, and the report is due actually in the next couple of weeks. But what that one entailed is asking teachers to look at the baseline, so to fill out a survey about each student in their class before the program, and then 6 months later after they've delivered the program in their classroom, which meant that we were looking at getting 1,000 students essentially assessed by teachers twice. So we were working with teachers who are busy anyway, and we were asking them to do not one survey but 25, and then again. So we wanted a really big pool of students. So we succeeded in getting 600 responses, which is really good, but it was really hard work to do that and then do it again 6 months later. So we communicated with the teachers at the beginning of that program to give them a heads up, and we made sure that the communication was coming internally from a couple of different places. So they were hearing from me, but they were also hearing from their direct contact at Ardoch, who they knew really well. And that person, because they had a strong relationship already, was really able to encourage them and to explain why we really valued their input and their opinion. And I'd agree that those email follow-ups over and over again, those email reminders really made a really, really big difference. And then the phone calls also made a difference. Sometimes the people completing our surveys weren't our only contact at the organisation, so we could actually communicate with principals and say, look, we know we're asking a lot of your teachers, but this is the bigger picture and this is the reason why, and we feel like this will really help us to make sure that the program we're delivering to you next year is the best that it can possibly be. So I think I agree with Kerry in terms of communication with stakeholders is absolutely the utmost importance. And part of that is giving people a heads up beforehand, how long it's going to take and why it's really important and how you're going to use it. And then we're hoping that if we share that afterwards, if we share what we've found out, then we're keeping those stakeholders so that next time we have to ask them for surveys to be completed, which happens, then they have the faith in us that we're using their time effectively and that it's helping everybody.
Absolutely, and it's like there are funny little hints and tricks. You know, in a program that I used to work on, I had someone get so excited about learning about automated text messages through the computer. I think there are some really, really cheap systems, and to be able to shoot out a text to, you know, people who you're asking to complete a survey to build an evidence base, to say, hey, please, please, please. Sometimes, you know, we really do pay more attention to the texts that come through on our phone rather than, you know, one email can get lost in many if you get it at the wrong time. But really having that constant follow-up is...
I think so. And I think the other interesting thing was that after the first round of surveys, when we were, you know, exhausted, and then one of the teachers said, look, you know, just as feedback, why don't you just give us the Excel spreadsheet with the student numbers, because everything, you know, for privacy, everyone's name was taken off, and we'll just do it on the spreadsheet rather than having to fill in the survey 25 times. And we were very tempted, because that's what I was thinking about in terms of stakeholder engagement and management. It's very tempting to, in the interest of getting people to actually do it, give them what they want or what they think that they want. And we were so tempted to do that. And then finally we were thinking and we realised, you know, on a survey, on an online tool, you can't proceed unless you've completed the questions, which are compulsory. And in terms of the data integrity, had we sent out an Excel spreadsheet to the teachers, there's no guarantee that they would actually have filled in every field. And sometimes the questions you find most difficult actually are going to get the data that is the most important. And so that's the data they wouldn't have filled in, and it would have compromised the entire study, and we would have had to go back to them again with the actual online, you know, piece of technology to do it again. So I think that was a big learning for us in terms of the difficulty of stakeholder management, that actually building really strong relationships and just getting it through the way you need it to be done is most important, and compromising is maybe less painful in the short term, but I think undermines the big picture and what you're trying to do.
I think it goes back to, you know, again, what Kerry was talking about, knowing what you want and who it's for, and knowing what questions and pieces of information are crucial. But, you know, moving along, I guess, so a lot of the organisations, some people who are online at the moment, you know, they do understand the value of building an evidence base and really want to invest in it. But, you know, like many organisations are under-resourced, you know, both in terms of time and funding. So do either of you have any advice? Like both of you at the moment are undertaking very well-established, you know, processes, but how can people start down this path of building an evidence base for their organisational program?
I think I would suggest firstly, I mean, not all evidence or data collation needs to be as significant as perhaps what we might have been talking about today, but it still might have a really significant impact on your organisation if you can gather it. So I guess trying to decide what it is exactly that you need and why first would be really good. But I would recommend firstly networking with similar or like-minded organisations, because they may already have undertaken similar research or evaluation and might already have established an evaluation framework that they would be happy to share if you spoke to them or asked them about that. With regard to research, I would contact universities and ask them what it is they might offer to whatever sector it is that you're working within. Many universities have charitable divisions or not-for-profit little sections that are funded by donors or their previous alumni, and they're established specifically to support people to run research programs. So I would ask them how they might be able to contribute to any research or evaluation that you're interested in undertaking. If the research will impact broader communities, then I would consider putting together a consortium of like-minded organisations. So if you have a challenge within your organisation that you need addressed by data collation, then most likely people in your sector or people in that local area may also be facing the same challenge. So you might find that if you speak to those people, they might be quite happy to put together a consortium and decide together to make it more time and cost effective running a program in a more unified manner across all of those. I already covered the be clear about what you want and who it will benefit, so I won't cover that again. I guess look at all the options. I mean, you might be able to gather the data that you need just using a simple SurveyMonkey survey that goes out to the right people and asks the right questions. That would be my primary recommendations, I think.
Absolutely. How about you? Any advice, Adele?
I think I talked right at the beginning about using the data you already have, and really thinking carefully about what you have so that you can possibly, get it from different places, put it in the same place. I also talked about an outcomes framework, and I think that again, looking at the patterns of what you already have and taking the time out just internally, I think some of it is just about time, thinking time. It doesn't have to be a lot, but I think it's just the right people. For us, it was really helpful to get people from different teams, because sometimes when you're in the middle of something, you can't necessarily see the patterns or ask the questions that other people ask when they don't quite understand as much. And they were just people within our own organisation, and I think that anyone can do that. I think being brave about what the information says and being brave to let people question you about it. And again, I think it does take a little bit of practice and bravery within an organisation, but it actually doesn't take any financial resource to say, I think what I'm seeing is that maybe we have a problem here, or maybe we do this really well. What does that mean? That does take a lot of bravery, and for other people to be able to question you and to say, well, what do you mean by that? And can you extrapolate? And what would it mean if we did that times 100? Or what would it mean if we did more of that for fewer people? And I think those kind of questions instigate a response to be, well, I don't know. Let's ask someone. And I think that again, it doesn't need a lot of investment to just have an actual attitude of curiosity and of asking. That comes for free. I think the other thing that comes for free is pro bono partners. And I think for us at Ardoch, they are just so instrumental. They are part of our community. They're part of that social network, the social capital. It's really interesting sometimes for them. We're here with Volunteering Victoria volunteers who have a background and can help us even come up with the right questions so that we feel confident that if we're going to be bothered asking someone questions on SurveyMonkey, that actually the questions we're asking are going to be the questions that are most valuable, and that doesn't have a financial impact if you can get a pro bono partner. So right at the beginning of last year, we benefited from a partner giving us 2 days of a consultant's time, because it happened to be a season, it was January, and they weren't really pressured at that time. And those 2 days helped us to set up all the questions for 38 different surveys. So that time set us up actually for the entire year, but it didn't need any financial resource for us. And the same thing has happened this year for a pro bono partner who's helping us with something else. actually a different program, but with the bravery to ask the question, because people can just say no if they want to, and just to say, look, we don't know if you can, but is there anyone there who just might like to help us analyse a few numbers, and it might be really interesting for them. And our experience has been that the more that we ask, the more that people say yes.
That's a great volunteering statistic, actually. You know, I think there's a really high percentage of people who say they would volunteer if, like, people just ask.
Yes.
People are most likely to volunteer if someone directly.
Yeah. And I would also, just building on what Adele said, encourage people to have the conversations around that evidence gathering within their own organisations with people that they might not think about, like open up a brainstorming session around afternoon tea even. So your marketing person might have something that they think would be critical. Your finance person might have something they think might be critical. Someone who, you know, even is an administrative person or just is a different thinker in a different role might have another opinion of what it is. And also, just building on the bravery comment, really ask the question. Don't be afraid to ask a question because you think you might look silly, because those types of questions are the ones that get everyone thinking about what the project would look like or what it is that you need and how it is you might go about it. So if you've got one person who's going to undertake the research and it's their project, really it would be remiss of them not to have the conversation with everybody, as many people as they can, before they start the planning process, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think, like, you know, from the perspective of, you know, us at Volunteering Victoria being a very small organisation, you know, we have built-in survey monkeys around a lot of our programs and events, so we can learn what people enjoyed or what worked for people, or, you know, gather ideas for how we could do things a little differently. But similarly, we did, you know, we have a pro bono volunteer who works with us on our membership survey, and that really has brought so much value to our organisation, and that is an example of really kind of one person assisting a smaller organisation to help us really design and make sure that we're getting the feedback that we want to keep, you know, I guess really making sure we're delivering for our members for a start. So we'll just, you know, turning our thoughts to the future, and you know, it's really become obvious that the emphasis of having an evidence base for your programs or for your sort of sector is really more and more important. And how do you think this has impacted the sector to date, and what do you think the future impacts will be? And just so everyone who's sort of online is aware, we will have just one more question after this, and then we'll throw over to you guys for questions. So we should have you all finished around about 3 p.m. So yeah, what do you think the future impacts will be, whether there's been an impact on the shift to must have an evidence base, how that's impacted organisations, and whether, like, what the future impacts will be?
Well, I think within the disability sector, definitely you need evidence. With the transition to the NDIS, it's created a fair amount of turmoil within the sector, particularly for the disability service providers. And to be able to have significant conversations with people and to create change, which is what is currently happening at the moment, you really do need to have some evidence behind what it is that you're saying. You can't just say this isn't working or this is working or we think this could be better if you don't have the evidence to back it up. So I would, you know, I would say definitely that it's going to have a major impact in the sector. The research project that we've been running, we hope will inform policy on a national basis. And that started from how are we going to retain volunteer supported services in the disability sector just within our local group of agencies, and it's grown to that. So, you know, things really do make a big difference if you're able to proceed with them. The outcomes component of the research will also be able to inform the different types of disability are volunteer-supported operating models for the disability service providers, and the models that fit within the ILC framework of the NDIS. So they might say, well, we would like to continue this program, but these are some of the things we need to do to adapt it so that it actually fits, so we can retain some funding moving forward for that. So I think at this point in time in our particular sector, it's really critical.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that more and more, in terms of those organisations who are seeking philanthropic funding and even corporate funding, that more and more the corporate partner and philanthropic trusts have their own aims and agenda and vision of what they want to achieve, where once upon a time there were some who worked innate and are interested more in this than that, but I think that that is much more significant now. And so a crucial question for them is, we are supporting you with this amount of funding, how are you supporting us to achieve our aims? So they want to know, well, how do you know? How do you know that what you're doing is working to achieve your aims and our aims as a philanthropist?
Wonderful. So on that note, just a final, more lighthearted question, because we really have been dealing with some incredibly complex and, I think, worthwhile topics, but, there are lots of online tools. We've mentioned a few, I think Excel, SurveyMonkey, different kind of online forms. There are lots of ones that have kind of cropped up that can help evidence-based an organisation, and I'm often hearing about different tools and things that can help. So do you guys have a favourite online tool that you've discovered? Maybe you're a SurveyMonkey fan, maybe you're a fan of good old Excel. Anything that you have seen, that doesn't necessarily cost a whole lot of money, that has helped you in building an evidence base?
For me, not particularly. Within our organisation, we use SurveyMonkey in terms of evaluation for support or services or programs. But with regard to research, I think the universities that you work with will have specific programs that are designed to gather that data. For me, it's more just keeping that personal approach and communicating with people, no matter what platform you're using, is really, really critical to getting people to respond to you.
We use SurveyMonkey as well. Something I've noticed in watching different staff use it is that having the tool and using it to get to people to ask the question is one thing, but a lot of the tools like Excel and definitely SurveyMonkey, they have capabilities that you need to work out or, to take advantage of and use it. So something like SurveyMonkey, has filtering tools, or it has comparative tools, so you can compare different regions. If their responses to particular questions, you can filter. So it's the same as using Excel, but it comes up with your fancy, charts and that kind of thing. And we're laughing here because actually what I'm saying should be obvious. But I'm just making that comment because I think that sometimes it's really easy to find the extra things that make you look like a superhero, and actually it's just the person next to you letting you know, if you press this and this, actually you're coming up with the goods, and it looks amazing. So I thought I'd throw that out there. We use a tool which isn't strictly for surveys, but it definitely helps us with our evaluations. I talked about using the data that you have already. So we collect our volunteer hours are logged on an app called Track It Forward, which isn't free, but it's really cheap. And that helps us to gather information, which is by the by. It's not having to send out a survey. It helps us gather information like year levels or days of the week or hours, or and have a look at, be able to compare different regions for how often people volunteer. So there's lots that we can do with that app, which actually isn't designed to do an evaluation. It's designed to help us do our actual work, which brings me full circle to using the information that we already have is actually really powerful.
Absolutely. And I would like to echo that point around learning how to use the tools. I personally have hopped around the office and, gleefully joy when I've discovered a new trick, or for me, working out how you could use Excel to filter and realize that you have to type your questions in horizontal columns rather than going down a spreadsheet as you might think more useful. To filter in columns is a lot easier than filtering in rows, and once I kind of cracked that, it was very helpful. So that really brings us to the end of my questions. In terms of the questions that I've seen come through, they're mostly around, the webinar being recorded, and the webinar is recorded and will be updated onto the Volunteering Victoria website over the next few days or within a week. And we're exploring transcripts into the future, so I'll come back to the one about a transcript, but we certainly hope to have that capability moving forward. Did anyone have any questions for the two presenters, Adele and Kerry, about their work, either through the Q&A button or through the chat? While I'm waiting just for a few of those to come through, I think they've been very, very comprehensive in their answers, so hopefully they have answered all your questions, but I'll just give you a brief reminder of a few things that are going on at Volunteering Victoria. Most notably, we have our conference coming up in June, and there's currently a call for presenters at the conference, which is open until March 14th. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested and like talking about volunteering, please think about submitting a call for the nominations through the web. There's a conference-specific website, so please check that out. And we also have a mentoring program which finishes this week, where we pair, people who are newer into volunteer management with people who've been in volunteer management a long time, and that closes this week as well. So, given that no other questions have come through, I really wanted to thank Kerry and Adele so much for giving us their time and talking about building an evidence base. And really, I hope it's offered you an opportunity to reflect on both the importance of building an evidence base, but how you might go about it. And again, encourage you to think, obviously the scale of your program or your research of building an evidence base may be smaller at this stage, but hopefully, some of what they've said has sparked some ideas about how you can move forward, or where, what the value of producing some of this data and information is. So really thank you all for your time, and we'll finish this off.
Thanks,
Sarah.